Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and we're continuing our series about a rabbi who, under his auspices, I believe the Rabbinic Bible was established, and what we would call the canon for Rabbinic Judaism was fixed, and that is Rabbi Akiba ben Joseph. And in previous episodes, we've gone over Jewish history from the beginning of the first Jewish revolt through the culmination with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70 until its final demise with the destruction of Masada. And we're looking at that interim period between the end of the first revolt and the beginning of the second Bar Kokhba revolt. And in the last episode, we showed how with the destruction of the temple, Judaism was in a serious tension in that it could no longer practice the Old Covenant in the way that's prescribed by the Law of Moses, because Law of Moses is integral to a practicing established priesthood, sacrifices, animal sacrifices, and of course, the tabernacle or the temple. And without the temple, there's this fundamental discontinuity, this tension that needs to be resolved within Judaism. And so we laid out that there are two different paths that were open. The first path that we explored in the last episode, so if you're just tuning in, you haven't seen the last episode, you need to in order to make sense of the rest of the series, is that the Jews would wage a second revolt against Rome and overthrow the Roman power, thereby establishing some autonomy and ultimately rebuilding the Jerusalem temple and reestablishing continuity with the Old Covenant. And one of the primary figures behind this second revolt is none other than Akiba ben Joseph, because he was the one who proclaimed the leader of the second revolt to be the Messiah prophesied in the book of Numbers. And this is Simon Bar Kokhba, which means son of the star, referring to that prophecy. And so the second Jewish revolt that begins in 132 through 135 AD is a messianic revolt. And we talked about how this false Messiah that was approved by this false prophet garnered support for the second revolt, which is very large support in the area. They even included some pagans, but there was one Jewish sect that also survived the first Jewish revolt intact that refused to join because it would mean repudiating their fundamental beliefs, and that is the Christians, because we believe that Yeshua, Jesus, is the Messiah. And so to join in under this false Messiah, Simon Bar Kokhba, would be to repudiate Jesus, as Justin Martyr says in his first apology. So from that point on, Christianity began to be viewed not just as menim, as heretics, but to be viewed as traitors as well. And so there's open conflict between Christians and Jews in this point. Anyway, as we showed in the last video, ultimately the Bar Kokhba revolt is crushed by Rome, and it unleashes a horrific persecution of the Jews, and by the way, also Christians, because the Romans didn't really see much difference between Christians and Jews at that point. It almost stomps out Judaism. Judaism barely survives the second Bar Kokhba revolt that was put in action by Rabbi Akiva. So that was one area that they attempted to resolve that tension with the destruction of the temple. In this video, we're going to look at the other side, the other path of reconciliation, that is the redefinition of Judaism along non-cultic lines. That is Judaism as a religion of the book and not a religion of the temple. And so fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse is beginning right now. So let's begin by looking at Akiba, because once again, just as Akiba was instrumental in promoting the Bar Kokhba revolt by identifying its leader as the Messiah, Rabbi Akiva is also very, very influential in Jewish theology, in that he redefines Judaism from a cultic religion with sacrifice and also a religion that's based on oral tradition to a religion of the book. And he does this in a couple of key ways. And what's the reason why we're focusing on this, folks, is because these key ways in which he does this ultimately points us to the fact that the rabbinic Bible, the text for the rabbinic Bible, becomes established. And once that's established within rabbinic Judaism, remember, this is post-Christian Judaism, long after the time of Christ, long after the death of the apostles, that the Jews have their own canon. So that's what we're going to do, is look at these different ways. And one way he did this was by transgressing what had been up to that point the established norm, namely that oral tradition was oral tradition. See, the problem is, now that the temple's destroyed, Judaism is now in a predicament because there are lots of questions that need to be answered that Judaism of the past couldn't answer based on their authoritative norms. And one of those obstacles was oral tradition. Now, according to the rabbis, oral tradition was not to be recorded in writings. As we see here in the Babylonian Talmud,
"These, the words of the Torah, you are to write, but not halakot." And Rabbi Yohanan ben Nappahah said, "Those who commit halakot to writing are considered as if they burnt the Torah." Babylonian Talmud, 1860b.
Oral tradition was not to be said in writing, and to do so would be to essentially burn the Torah, which may seem a little perplexing, but David Gruber offers this explanation.
The dictum of Rabbi Yohanan parallels the wording of a similar barata, b. Shabbat 115b and Tosefta Shabbat 13:4, with regard to the writing of blessings. Those who write down blessings are considered as if they burnt the Torah, the technical reason being that such writings, though they contain scriptural quotations, would not be evacuated from a fire on the Sabbath.
I find that very interesting, and it makes a lot of sense. See, there were laws and stipulations that the words of God should never be burned, and hence the Torah is to be rescued from synagogues during a time of fire. So during an emergency, you have to save the Torah scroll, which makes perfect sense. But what the statute says is that if you write down a blessing, the blessing may contain words of the Torah. Now, written blessings would not be on your tick list for things to rescue from the flames. You would go after the Torah scroll. You wouldn't try to grab all the written blessings or something like that, even though they contain Torah. So you weren't supposed to write down the blessings so that if there was a fire, the words of the Torah would not be burned. Well, essentially the same thinking is applied to oral tradition, that oral tradition could contain Torah. And so if you write down the oral traditions and there is a fire, then guess what? The oral traditions would not be saved, even though they have the words of the Torah. And hence, if you write down oral tradition, you're basically endangering, as it were, the desecration of the words of the Torah. So it was strictly forbidden within rabbinic tradition. Well, Rabbi Akiva goes against this dictum, and he begins to put down in writing oral tradition. So this is a break of continuity with the past.
To be faithful to their traditions and understanding of Torah, the traditional rabbis would not write down their traditions. If they did not written them down, then their traditions would be replaced by Rabbi Akiva's. Akiva was not creating an impartial history, he was pursuing a radical agenda. He abolished the foundation of the oral tradition.
Quite genius in a way, because by writing down oral tradition, he sets a standard of which traditions will be kept and preserved. And if anybody wants to continue and preserve other traditions that Akiba did not record, guess what? You need to break the dictum against writing down tradition. So in a very real way, Rabbi Akiba becomes an editor of oral tradition. And in fact, this is expressed in the vote of Rabbi Nathan or Natan, in which he says about Akiva,
"To what may Akiva be compared?" asked one of his pupils, describing the activities in which he engaged at this time. "To a peddler who goes about from farm to farm. Here he obtains wheat, there barley, and in a third place, spelt. When he comes home he arranged them all in their respective bins. So Akiba went about from scholar to scholar, getting all the traditions he could, and then he proceeded to arrange them in an orderly granary."
So Akiba is kind of like a person who goes to different markets, takes different samples, comes home and systematizes it, puts all the different samples in their proper order. So he does so with oral tradition. He gets some oral tradition here, some oral tradition there. He brings all the oral traditions together and he systematizes it in what's known as the Mishnah, or at least he lays down the foundation for what will be called the Mishnah later on. So he is going and picking different things in a very real way. He's an editor of oral tradition. And that means that he doesn't consign all oral traditions, all oral traditions that go back into the first century. He doesn't preserve them all. Rather, he preserves the ones that fits his needs for redefining Judaism along non-cultic lines. And this is brought out very, very ably by Louis Finkelstein in his work Akiba, Scholar, Saint, and Martyr. And Finkelstein says this:
"Having decided on the method which he would follow in the arrangement of his material, Akiba even more boldly replaced ancient norms with others which represented his own opinions. Such, however, was the authority he came to enjoy that within a generation the rejected material was almost unknown. Indeed, much of it has been irrevocably lost, but a few fragments were preserved and handed down by antiquarians like Akiva's disciple, Jose ben Halafta."
This, I think, is key. Certain elements which Finkelstein explains that Akiva changes the norms. He accepts the oral traditions that agree with him. He proposes his own innovations as part of oral tradition. But I think the key thing to walk away from here is that those oral traditions that Akiva did not consign to writing were lost. Within one generation, Finkelstein says that these traditions are irrevocably gone. They're just gone from the face of the earth. Why? Because Akiba's prestige was such that they were just simply discarded as obsolete, and a new set of oral traditions, a new format, was placed within Judaism. And so we talked about this choke point that occurs in history with the destruction of the temple and the ascension of Akiba. He puts it in a unique role to really change and form the path of Judaism, post-Christian rabbinic Judaism. In fact, in a very way, he is the person who originates rabbinic Judaism. In fact, the Talmud calls him the chief of sages. Okay, so I think it's good for us to kind of get a chronological picture of what's going on here. You have Rabbi Akiba, who is writing down oral traditions, and also you have his disciples following afterwards, continuing Akiba's work of codifying oral tradition. So you have a group of written tradition. This is known as the Mishnah. This is the earliest period of codification in rabbinic literature. So the Mishnah begins with Akiba. It ultimately is completed by Judah the prince, under the auspices of Rabbi Meir, who is also very influential. This ends at the end of the second Christian century. Then moving on chronologically, you have the commentary on the Mishnah, known as the Gemara. In the Gemara, there are two versions. One is a Jerusalem Talmud, and the other is the Babylonian Talmud, sometimes called the Babi. The Jerusalem Talmud was compiled somewhere around 350 to 400 AD, so well into the Christian centuries. The Babylonian Talmud ultimately was compiled all the way to about the year 500 AD. So these are very late commentaries, and of course there's other groups of writings in addition to the Mishnah and the Talmud. And so as you can see, you have the Mishnah with Akiba and his disciples formulating the Mishnah, and then the Talmuds, the commentaries on the Mishnah. So everything is based upon the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is ultimately based upon Akiba. In fact, in Sanhedrin 86a, it says,
"Do not let that possibility come to mind, for Rabbi Yohanan has stated, an unassigned teaching of the Mishnah represents the view of Rabbi Meir, an unassigned teaching in the Tosefta represents the view of Rabbi Nehemiah, an unassigned teaching in the Sifra represents the view of Rabbi Judah, an unassigned opinion in the Sifra represents the view of Rabbi Simeon, and all of them express their views in line with those of Rabbi Akiba." Sanhedrin 86a.
And as you probably noticed, all the names here are all part of that school of Akiba. Hence, all of these writings, at least the unattributed quotations, come from one of Akiba's disciples, and all of Akiba's disciples ultimately reflect Akiba's opinion. So in a very real way, Akiba does change the way Judaism looks at itself and redefines Judaism as a religion of the book, no longer as a cultic entity. Now, I'm not saying he's the only one who does this, but he is really the prime mover. And in a very real way, he is the founder of Rabbinic Judaism. But there is more than just oral tradition. There is written tradition. And as Louis Finkelstein says,
Akiba was trying to change the complexion of the inherited law. To accomplish this, he had to find an authority superior to that of his predecessors and accepted by everyone. Only one instrument could fulfill those requirements: Scripture itself. Louis Finkelstein, Akiva, scholar, saint, and martyr.
So there is one more roadblock for the redefinition of Judaism, and that is sacred scripture. So since Akiba is able to amend oral tradition in such a way as to be conducive to its survival after the destruction of the temple, something needs to be done with sacred scripture as well. And there Akiba does something incredibly innovative in order to have scripture answer and provide solutions to objections that it never considered. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode. So hopefully you like this video. If so, please hit the thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. Also, William Albrecht and myself are on Patreon. We appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Gary Machuda. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.